Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Today we welcome you back to almost the series that's about to conclude, Hot Talk, Passionate Debate for New Age. This is next to the last week. On our last program, it will be Senator Larry Craig talking about the Second Amendment and gun ownership. And on this next to the last program, we're so pleased to welcome to our program Dr. Marilyn Levine. Dr. Levine's been a friend a long time, and she now serves as the chair of the Division of Social Sciences at Lewis Clark State College in Lewiston, Idaho. Our guest holds a doctoral degree from the University of Chicago in modern Chinese history and earned a master's degree in Southeast Asia history from the University of Hawaii. Our distinguished guest is published. She has published 2 books and numerous articles. In addition to that, she has given many, many presentations, dozens and dozens of presentations, not only in this country but around the world, including such places as Taiwan, Hong Kong, France, Germany, and Italy. And she has also been invited to be a guest professor at such places as the University of Heidelberg. In this symposium this week at North Idaho College, she addressed the question of violence and technology and its impact on the 20th and 21st century. Dr. Levine, it's so good to have you with us. Dr. Levine, you have been generous with your time today, and we greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to doing the program.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and it is an honor to be a speaker at the conference and to be with such distinguished company.
Thank you. And we're our regular panelists. We're so pleased to have them here today. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho. And next to her is our second panelist, the Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, Erna Reinhardt. And Janelle will commence today's questioning.
Welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you here. I want to ask the first question about the history. Can you bring us up to date? What's happened? What's created this violence that we know about in the 21st century?
Well, in my talk, and I was specifically asked to speak about violence and technology, if one looks at the Industrial Revolution, it created many advantages, many benefits that we know of, but issues such as urbanization, increased enclosure, population density, that's one factor. The other factor is the wealth was obtained to fund the Industrial Revolution through conquering other countries. Now, in my discussion, what I mentioned is that if you look at the 19th century, it's the century of Europe and European imperialism, particularly Great Britain. And they took inventions that the Chinese had actually invented, gunpowder, the compass, but the Chinese were using the compass for geomancy and the gunpowder to scare away spirits at the New Year's. The Westerners rather took them a different way, to go around the world, to circumvent, navigate the world, to conquer other countries with the guns as opposed to swords. So there is a whole different mentality there between East and West. Looked upon from the long term of world history, you're talking about a century and a half of interchange where the West dominates. And I think as we look at violence and the proclivity of it, particularly in the West, and then it declines in Europe and accelerates in the United States. And I'm wondering if some of that is because the people who settled the United States were nonconformist. In the Industrial Revolution, although they were only 3% of the population, 50% of the entrepreneurs were of nonconformist religious sects. And these people settled this country. So is there a linkage between a culture of violence and the really discernible differences between violence in the United States and violence elsewhere, at least internal violence?
Thank you.
Erna Reinhardt.
Welcome to the show, Marilyn. It's great to have you here. Can you give us some examples of the different types of violence throughout the time period that we're discussing today, and how violence itself has changed over time?
Well, I think a very good example is maybe not to use the violence in the U.S., but let's look at Japan. Japan, which adopted a lot of its cultural heritage and values from the Chinese, is a good example of how culture influences attitudes towards violence. The Chinese have a saying, 士农工商, which means the social hierarchy of the scholar, then the peasant, then the artisan, and businessmen were in the last. The Japanese adopted that, except at the top, it wasn't shi, but samurai. And their military warriors became the head of their hierarchy. And you had a whole series of several hundred years of what they called tent government. And later in the Meiji Restoration, when they industrialized, a lot of the leadership of the entrepreneurs was shown by the warrior class, even though they voluntarily gave up their samurai status to be perceived of as modern. So, internally they had quite a bit of violence in those civil wars and in that history. But externally, they had not necessarily generated genocide or brutal violence, although they tried to conquer other nations like Korea and China. But beginning in the 20th century, and I'm not sure why, and historians aren't sure why, they began to use more brutal tactics. And this is why we have to look at violence and technology. Was the greater sophistication of guns, the greater sophistication of weapons, and the greater sense of imperialist, I am fitter than you, and you are less human than me. What was the culture that induced them in the rape of Nanjing, and even the Koreans to cultural genocide when they conquered Korea in 1910? What was the culture of violence within their culture that did that? That's a concrete example of how people who were very isolated then went ahead and began to have that imperialist tendency. And at the same period, one might add, is when Germany began to industrialize and modernize the 1870s as well. Don't get me started on history, guys.
We had a professor for your institution here 3 or 4 years ago, and he was very similar to you in the data he presented about as we move from century to century, particularly the 20th and 21st, how there's been a soaring of death through violence. And you certainly had, and you do have some very powerful statistics. Would you take a few minutes to show us that starting around 1900, even by the periods of 30, 40 years, show us how that has escalated in the hundreds of thousands and millions who have died by violence?
Well, it's interesting because in 1804, there were, at the turn of the century, you really want the 20th century, at the turn of the century, Europe hadn't had a war in 30 years. And then you see the real great wars begin and the notion of world war. And once somebody had a world war, the idea that you could have it was horrifying. At the same time, it happened. The clock can never be set back once you embark on an immoral road. And so you have the First World War, which plants the seeds for the Second World War by the retribution and recrimination, the guilt clause, and the ensuing depression that follows economically. But in that sense, you really make it the Second World War is the real World War, because it then involves Asia, because Japan joins the Axis powers and conquers all of Southeast Asia and tries for South Asia and East Asia. So you have an escalation of death that is a really, really gruesome. For example, in World War II, you have, as we know, about 20 million people in the Soviet Union die. At least that many probably died in China. Millions of people in Europe. The Americans didn't fare so badly, but we had several 100,000 people perish in World War II. And that's just that type of violence. I think initially you were asking. We were not talking about sexual assault. We're not talking about the cultural issues. Christians, for example, were asked to bow before Shinto shrines against their religion and maybe tortured too. So that part of it throughout the current world history has escalated. After World War II, the violence even becomes worse. But then the nature of it changes oftentimes to civil war and ethnic violence. And you have horrendous genocide take place in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, and terrible, terrible atrocities committed. I would say that the 20th century is a century of mega violence, and we're not starting out the 21st much better.
You know, when you look at numbers, they're just so incredibly sad and disastrous. You had over 6 million Jewish people killed by Hitler, and we lost over 400,000 brave Americans. And then you had the numbers you gave in the Soviet Union and China, and more recently Rwanda, the genocide there. Just one more question before going back to the panel. This other professor said when he was here, he wasn't sure that it was the human nature that had changed, but that humans had been able to create the technology to make the numbers so much larger, that throughout history there's unfortunately a sadness about violence throughout history. But now the weaponry, the technology, created even a greater, when the conflict came, greater destruction. Do you also subscribe to that?
I think of both are really the truth. I think we have increased our technology. It took Hitler from 1939 to, actually he started his program before obviously, but 1939 to 1945 to kill those 6 million people. And it took 100 hours to kill 100,000 Iraqis in the first Gulf War because of the uses of technology. Vietnam taught us about using technology to kill from a distance. And I think it's true that the distance of killing, and now we can use robots even, and we've been experimenting with so-called smart bombs, which to me is an ironic term. So we have the technology, but I think in addition to this, there are other issues. The one issue I highlighted today was population increase and population density. I think that the fact that there's so few resources, I see tremendous violence that will occur much more than over oil, over water. Freshwater resources are declining at such a rapid rate that there's already great violence in Africa, in the Mideast, and a lot of that isn't over oil. A lot of it is over drinkable water. As we have population increase, let me give you an example. In 1804, there were 1 billion people in the world. 1927, that's more than 120 years, 2 billion people in the world. But from 1950 to 1990, in a 40-year period, the world population doubled from 2.5 billion to 5 billion people, and by 2000, the world population reached 6 billion. Now, of these 6 billion people, 3 billion people live in abject poverty, not U.S. standard of poverty that they qualify for assistance, really grueling poverty, half of our world's population. How could we think that A, the population density, the development of megacities is not going to lead to violence, and secondarily lead to a desensitization to one another? And I would say that I've noticed recently, in the past 4 years or so, a sensibility of dismay, of despair, and therefore apathy.
Thank you. Janelle Berg.
I want to talk a little bit about nationalism and the growth of nationalism and how that fits into this whole picture. Can you explain?
What an excellent question. Actually, I think it's very relevant. I think that we now assume that when soldiers are asked to take up arms and go fight for the country, that's a very natural thing to do. Actually, nationalism, and in fact, is a subset of ideology. Ideology is actually an 18th century term. It's a relatively new term in our Western society. And you know that it didn't exist in a place like China as a concept. And in fact, they haven't really taken it on until the 80s. But now they're taking it on with a lot of enthusiasm. So nationalism as a force, we oftentimes see it as an unwilling, oh, it's a wonderful thing, let's rally around. But it really started with the French Revolution and to some extent the American Revolution. And there it was a slower gestation period and adaptation. But it's a modern term in history, and it's, along with the other ideologies, fascism, communism, Marxism, it's an ism. It's an ideology. And I'm not making a value judgment about one or the other. You know, they have, I don't think fascism has many good points, but they have some good points as ideologies, but they tend to make people believe in our side against them. It creates the notion of struggle with an enemy. That's, for example, one thing Lenin clearly pointed out when he developed his component of Marxism, that you always had to have an enemy. And we have found ourselves at a loss in this country since the Soviet Union has changed so much, and of course now China is capitalist for all intents and purposes, although they are run by a communist government. It's hard to find that enemy.
Erna Reinhardt.
Marilyn, share with us a little bit your thoughts on how media plays a role in today's behaviors that we see in so many of our young people, and maybe contrast that with some other European countries, and maybe is there a difference there between the kinds of things that the youth are seeing in those countries and the kinds of things that our youth are seeing through TVs, magazines, video games, those kinds of things, and the effect that that may have on social behaviors that lead to violence?
Well, that's a very interesting question. My experiences with France and Germany, and then going to Asian countries like Taiwan and China and Hong Kong, and then contrasting it with our country. And because I, also in my teaching communicate with young people, I think I have a little bit idea of that. I think media directly, because media is now so globalized, that's one issue. It's a more connected world. But the societies are very different. So you may be seeing the same program in China as in the United States or as in France, but the impact is different because the social mores are different. Attitudes toward sex, attitudes toward violence are very different. In general, Europeans think we're way too violent in our media, but they think we're very prudish and hypocritical in terms of sex. Personally, I'm astounded at what gets put on the TV with these reality shows. I particularly think the Survivor series that encourages competition, cutthroat, and just for the aggrandizement of money in your moment of celebrity is a very negative impact on our way of behaving toward each other. What do we learn from that? What do our children learn from that? And some of these shows model the behavior, I think, that is really destructive of our family, destructive of our cultural system and our positive values, because I believe that the people in the United States are very generous, good people. We don't portray this in the way we have these so-called reality shows or situational comedies. We have a great disconnect. The problem is that especially now with the CSI series and these gruesome shows that will show every bullet being taken out and how it pierces your body and so on, that perhaps studies will show desensitize us a bit to death, to blood. Those cases where the woman actually cut a child out of another woman recently. I mean, where did she get that idea even from, that anyone could go and take a knife and cut somebody up? We're headed in a slippery slope. Internationally, our culture is pretty pervasive in terms of rock and roll music, not so much anymore in terms of the situational comedies or the soap operas. I could speak a lot longer about this.
I want to follow up on Erna's question. Some other things you said today that has to do with those shows, and indicating that if you'd elaborate upon the fact that they engage in the process, not only the young people but their parents and what the parents are consenting to, and that also affects the cultural value system.
Yeah, I actually have to confess, I may have only seen a few minutes of any of these shows, but one that I actually watched was, I forgot the title, but it was about Not With My Daughter or Take My Daughter. It might as well have been Take My Daughter. And it was about parents who were vetting these 3 young men as possible dates for their daughter for a week in Hawaii. Now, you have this most hypocritical situation. They're setting it up as if they're virtuous parents who in the middle of the show will be told a lie that each of these gentlemen are doing, and the men have to go cheerlead with the daughter, and they have to talk about and dance around these topics, which are in fact sexual, or about trust, or about love. And love is left right out of it. Respect is left right out of it, because at the end of the day, what is going to happen? The prize is a week in Hawaii with the young woman. Now, either these parents are incredibly stupid or something, but there's certainly the height of hypocrisy to sit there and say, well, you're just not good enough for my daughter because you lie. You're just going to take advantage of her. Well, duh, what do they think is going to happen? So I think we have this culture of anything goes just so that I can be on television and seem a certain way somehow by these parents. It just was, it struck me that it's sending the wrong message to our young people, and the wrong message about our family system. There are many dedicated families in our society too.
One of the questions has to do with in technology and videos, and it's often been thought that some of these very, very violent videos now, where part of it is even shooting police officers and all the videos, that has a relationship to some violence we've been seeing recently with young people. And we're taping this show in March, and recently there was just the last few days that awful tragedy and awful crime in Minnesota at a high school. And according to the reports I've seen in the media, he too had games he played in video. So would you speak to that issue?
I think we very much underestimate the impact of technology, video and web, on the ethics and the social behavior of our society. I have 12 websites, and I work in educational technology and new learning technologies, and I actually am teaching a course not only for my students at Lewis Clark State College, but for teachers across Idaho. I've been doing some workshops on rock and roll as art and history, and teaching cross-generational conversation and understanding. I think we are failing to understand the impact of these behaviors in training our young people to accept things. On the other hand, the other problem is we're not listening to them. We are not listening to them on their own terms, in their own reality. We are living in Father Knows Best land, and our students and our children are raised on Homer Simpson. And there's one Springfield in one place and one Springfield in the other place, and we're not looking at how they're thinking. We too easily dismiss their music because, of course, everybody thinks the 60s is the best, and that's what you notice all the CSIs have The Who at the start of every one of them. Why not play something from current rock and roll? Why not try and bridge the gap and understand what they're saying, and what are the similarities as well as the differences?
Thank you. Janelle.
Please comment on the relationship between violence and the following 3 things: fear, 1, anger, 2, and frustration, 3. So the kind of relationship between violence and fear first.
This is a brilliant question, and the culture of fear is something that has been highlighted very strongly in recent social science literature, particularly with regard to the United States. For example, in Bowling for Columbine, which is very relevant to the recent tragedy, Michael Moore makes an excellent point. He goes to Canada and discovers Canadians actually have more arms than we do in the United States. And yet they have 4 mounted police are killed. The whole country mourns. If we have policemen shot in action, I dare say we hardly even hear about it. And he notes the difference is the United States has this culture of fear. We have these big SUVs because we want to be protected. We have multiple guns because we want to be protected. We're afraid. And of course, since 9/11, people have been walking around in fear of terrorists everywhere. It has resulted in ethnic, in gender, and in all kinds of personal alienation where people once could trust. We are learning how not to trust. The other thing is I think people at a psychological level then feel a culture of anger because none of us wants to feel that alienation. So people are becoming more angry because their rights are violated, the quality of their life is violated, and so there's anger at the invasion of privacy and all these other issues that have arisen, and the sacrifice, frankly, that has to take place to fund a war. That also leads to anger. And I think the frustration is not just in the United States. I think it's worldwide. As I said, 3 billion people living in poverty. You know, if you have a 50% unemployment rate, what do you think those young men are going to do in that society? Well, it's time for revolt and revolution. This has been the trend throughout history. It's just much more, because of the technology, deadly right now. Sorry to sound so.
None of us has a crystal ball, but I'm very curious to ask you, as a social scientist, where do you see us going? And I realize that you study behaviors of today and historically, but what are your thoughts on where we're headed?
I don't know the answer to that, but I personally am very optimistic, and the reason for that is I'm an optimistic human being. So I happen to be an idealist myself. But I think that we have some solutions if we cooperate together. The most important thing is for our generation to understand that we are not holding up to our responsibility. We need to better our modeling. We need to better our communication. In other words, we need to also listen as well as to expound what young people are really thinking, like the question on the video games. Yeah, meanwhile, they've been raised like that. So what do? Do we say, you're not my child, you're not my student? We can't. We have to understand people as they are. And that includes other cultures as well. So we have to be diverse in our understanding. And we have to model what we think is ethical behavior. That's why I get very involved in web work and in technology. I want to model the antithesis. But in terms of society, we have to think about making the pie bigger. We have, as in the United States, we're noted for our creativity and our productivity and our work ethic.
I'm sorry to interrupt. The clock always wins on our program. We're out of time. It went so quickly. Dr.
No kidding.
Marilyn Levine, thank you so very, very much for being with us. And it's been most informative. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us again next week when we'll do the last program of this particular series called Hot Talk, when Senator Larry Craig will be with us. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.